A spaceship large enough to hold a human life from birth to death would no longer be a vehicle in the ordinary sense. It would not be a craft carrying passengers through a temporary inconvenience called distance. It would be a world with walls. That difference changes everything. People are used to imagining ships as instruments of transit, objects defined by where they are going rather than by what they are in themselves. But the moment a human being can be born inside one, grow to adulthood inside one, fall in love, raise children, grow old, and die without ever stepping onto a planet, the ship ceases to be a means and becomes an environment. It must do more than travel. It must replace Earth in every invisible way. People usually forget Earth is doing anything at all. This is the first shock hidden inside the question. Could humans live their entire lives inside a spaceship? At first, it sounds like a matter of engineering scale. Make it large enough. Make it safe enough. Add food production, air recycling, artificial gravity, medicine, schools, maybe gardens, maybe some kind of government, and perhaps life can go on. But that first answer is too mechanical. Human life is not the simple continuation of breathing, eating, reproducing, and surviving accidents. Human life depends on rhythms, variety, boredom, beauty, privacy, authority, rebellion, purpose, memory, error, and the strange tolerances by which a society forgives confinement because it still contains enough freedom to remain worth inhabiting. A ship that must hold full lives would have to become not just technically viable, but spiritually habitable. That is why the idea is both fascinating and frightening. A world ship, a generation vessel, an artificial habitat drifting through interstellar dark, would ask whether human civilization can be compressed without becoming distorted beyond recognition. Air, water, food, law, education, reproduction, inheritance, conflict, religion, waste, architecture, illness, music, and despair would all have to fit within one sealed design. If Earth is the great original generosity of life, then a ship built to hold entire generations would be the first serious attempt to imitate that generosity by calculation. It would test not only whether humans can survive in a machine, but whether a machine can become humane enough to contain history. The first practical problem is one so basic that precisely for that reason it is easy to underestimate: air. On Earth, air is not experienced as infrastructure. It is felt as background, an element so abundant and so constantly renewed at planetary scale that most people do not think about it until smoke, pollution, altitude, or suffocation makes its presence suddenly moral. Inside a lifelong spaceship, air would lose all innocence. It would become a managed substance, circulated, filtered, monitored, corrected, cooled, humidified, dehumidified, scrubbed of carbon dioxide, protected from contaminants, defended against microbial imbalance, and treated as one of the central political facts of existence. A single human breath is trivial. A city's breathing is a system. A multi-generational ship would need to treat atmosphere not as a simple supply, but as a living loop. Oxygen generation could come from electrolysis, plant systems, algae, or more advanced chemical processes. But none of these are magic. Each has maintenance burdens, failure modes, and dependencies on other parts of the habitat. Carbon dioxide must be captured. Trace contaminants must be removed. Pressure must remain stable. Temperature gradients must be controlled. Airflow cannot simply exist. It has to be designed so that stale pockets, microbial reservoirs, or unnoticed chemical accumulations do not slowly transform the entire vessel into a quietly worsening hazard. That is what makes the atmosphere so terrifying in a closed world. It is not dramatic by default. It is intimate. A fire on a ship is frightening because it is visible. A slow decline in air quality may be more dangerous precisely because it is gradual. Headaches, fatigue, poor sleep, cognitive drift, irritation, unexplained illness, microbial bloom, system strain, none of these look at first like the collapse of a world. Yet if the world is sealed, such symptoms are not local inconveniences. They are atmospheric truth speaking through the body. A ship large enough for generations would therefore need people whose ordinary labor resembles planetary stewardship compressed into corridors and ducts. Water would be even more unforgiving because water on Earth teaches the wrong lesson by being vast. Rivers, rainfall, oceans, aquifers, and evaporation create the impression that water belongs to the world in a naturally circulating abundance that no human institution is responsible for. A spaceship destroys that illusion at once. Every drop used for drinking, washing, farming, medicine, sanitation, cooling, and industry must remain inside a disciplined cycle unless the ship is built with absurd redundancy. Wastewater, urine, humidity, condensation, industrial runoff, and biological residues all become part of the same moral economy. To leak water in deep space is not merely to spill, it is to shorten the future. This changes domestic life into something much more serious than it first appears. Showers are no longer personal refreshment alone. Laundry is no longer ordinary hygiene alone. Cooking, cleaning, and flushing become visible acts inside the metabolism of a closed world. Children born on such a ship would likely be educated from the beginning to understand water not as background abundance but as circulating inheritance. They might grow up with a sensibility more exact than ours, one in which the phrase wasting water sounds not metaphorical or virtuous, but almost anatomically true. Yet efficiency alone would not solve the problem. A civilization cannot live indefinitely in a state of obvious rationing without something harsher happening to its culture. People need not only adequate resources, but enough margin to feel that life contains generosity rather than continuous restraint. A successful world ship would therefore need water systems so reliable and so intelligently designed that conservation could be deeply embedded without turning every domestic gesture into visible austerity. That is a difficult threshold. It requires technology good enough to disappear from daily anxiety, because a society that feels its own plumbing every hour does not remain psychologically light for long. Food then enters, and with it the first full sense that a ship holding generations must become an ecology rather than a machine in the narrow sense. Stored supplies can serve a mission of years. They cannot carry an entire civilization of births and deaths unless the population remains tiny and the mass budget becomes absurd. A real generation vessel would need continuous food production, which means light, nutrients, microbial control, pollination strategies or substitutes, waste recycling, seed banks, crop diversity, pest management, and a culture capable of treating agriculture as civilizational core rather than decorative support. Earth hides the complexity of food behind weather, soil, ecosystems, pollinators, continental scale, and centuries of accumulated abundance. A ship has none of these invisible subsidies. Hydroponics, aeroponics, algae bioreactors, fungal systems, cultured proteins, cellular agriculture, insect protein, carefully chosen grains and vegetables, perhaps even trees in managed park zones, all might contribute. But every one of these systems would be tied to light budgets, water purity, nutrient loops, microbial health, and labor. A crop failure in a nation can be mitigated by imports. A crop failure on a sealed ship becomes a constitutional event. This would shape cuisine, class, celebration, and identity. Food on such a ship could become monotonous if design were poor, and monotony over generations is not a minor aesthetic complaint. It corrodes morale. The successful ship would need food culture, not only calories. It would need flavor, ritual, celebration meals, regional variation inside the vessel perhaps, garden produce that feels alive rather than purely industrial, and enough culinary creativity to prevent nutrition from collapsing into punishment. A people can endure confinement more easily if the table remains one of the places where life still feels abundant. In that sense, chefs, growers, microbiologists, and systems engineers may become as important to the future of a ship as navigators. But food is not only a technical or cultural problem, it is a political one. In any closed world, whoever controls the food systems controls more than agriculture. They influence health, labor rhythms, emergency planning, class structure, and perhaps even ideology. A generation ship with severe social hierarchy could turn food into visible power. Fresh produce versus synthetic staple, private garden access versus communal allotment, celebration tables for one class and nutritional sufficiency for another. A ship designed with inequality at its core would not need spectacular brutality to become oppressive. The menu itself would speak. That is why a world ship built honestly must distribute not only calories, but dignity. Agriculture would need to be organized so that dependence on shared systems does not become daily humiliation. Some of that may be technological, some architectural, some legal, yet much of it would be cultural. People must feel that the systems feeding them belong to the common future rather than to an inherited ruling tier. Otherwise, the ship becomes not a world, but a prison whose bars are hidden inside ecological dependency. This is one of the reasons the question is so morally severe. Could humans live entire lives inside a spaceship? Yes, perhaps under certain technical conditions. But could they do so without food becoming an instrument of silent stratification? That is harder. A ship can keep bodies alive and still starve justice. The two problems must never be confused. Then there is gravity, which most people only notice by its absence. Human bodies are written by Earth's pull. Bones, muscles, posture, cardiovascular regulation, development, balance, pregnancy, childhood growth, and even casual gestures assume one steady downward persuasion. A spaceship meant only for transit can perhaps accept health damage for a short while or mitigate it through exercise. A ship meant to hold full lifetimes cannot. It must either create artificial gravity, perhaps through rotation, or accept that it is manufacturing a future population whose bodies may no longer resemble the baseline from which the mission began. Rotation is conceptually elegant and practically severe. Build a habitat large enough, spin it at suitable rates, and something like gravity returns through centrifugal acceleration. Yet the engineering difficulty is formidable. Large rotating structures require mass, structural reliability, vibration management, bearing or tether systems, emergency contingencies, and long-term maintenance across many generations. Smaller rotating systems introduce motion sickness and strange Coriolis effects that human bodies do not love. So the question is not whether artificial gravity is imaginable. It is whether it can become ordinary enough that a child born in the habitat experiences it as home rather than as a mechanical compromise. If not, then the ship is no longer merely transporting humanity. It is selecting for new physiology. Over many generations, low gravity or variable gravity environments could reshape bodies, expectations, perhaps even politics. A population unable to tolerate Earth-normal gravity may cease emotionally to regard Earth as a real potential home, even if it remembers it culturally. This gives the ship a strange power. It may not just preserve the species through distance, it may quietly author a new one. Reproduction then becomes central, because the moment births occur aboard, the mission crosses from travel into inheritance. Adults who volunteered for a journey accepted a burden, perhaps with great deliberation. Children born aboard never did. A ship that contains reproduction must therefore answer a much harder question than how to keep a crew alive. It must answer whether the unborn can be ethically bound to a closed environment, a fixed destination, a predefined social order, and a limited pool of future choices. Biologically, reproduction in a closed world is already complex. Prenatal care, pediatric health, bone development, genetic monitoring, fertility choices, population control, partner choice, kinship management, and the prevention of dangerous bottlenecks all become strategic concerns. A ship with too small a population risks genetic narrowing unless sophisticated reproductive planning, embryo libraries, or later genomic intervention are used. A ship with too rapid population growth risks ecological overshoot. The future of the society may depend on intimate decisions that no planetary civilization usually feels entitled to supervise so directly, and yet supervision may become unavoidable. Population size in a closed world is not an abstraction. It is tied to food, air, space, water, schooling, mental health, maintenance capacity, and emergency margin. Reproduction therefore becomes not merely private life but civilizational arithmetic. That is dangerous territory. Any society that regulates birth too hard risks becoming morally sterile or tyrannical. Any society that pretends birth is only personal choice risks ecological breakdown. A successful ship would need an ethics of reproduction subtle enough to protect freedom and stern enough to remember that there is no outside into which excess can disappear. This is where kinship becomes one of the great hidden engineering problems. On Earth, populations are vast enough that family structure and mate choice are softened by scale. On a ship, scale narrows. Even with careful design, the social world may become small enough that ancestry, obligation, and proximity interlace in ways difficult to manage across centuries. Who is related to whom? How is genetic diversity maintained? Do people have access to stored genetic material from Earth? Are there formal reproductive councils? How much can custom handle and how much must law specify? These are not secondary questions. They decide whether the ship remains viable without turning intimacy into administration. The emotional burden would be immense. Adolescence on such a ship would not be simple youthful rebellion in corridors. It would unfold beneath the knowledge that partner choice, fertility, and family size have consequences not just for private lives, but for the carrying capacity of the world. This could produce maturity early. It could also produce resentment, secrecy, black markets in privacy, new rituals of courtship, and perhaps deep arguments about whether life inside the vessel is too governed to remain fully human. One can imagine different answers in different ship cultures. Some may become austere, almost monastic in demographic discipline. Others may use technology to widen reproductive freedom. Still others may split into clans, civic units, or carefully managed lineages. In every case, the ship would have to admit something Earth allowed humans to ignore for a long time. Reproduction is not only biological continuity, it is governance by other means. Then comes society, in the fullest sense. A world ship cannot be a population plus machines. It must be a culture. People must know what they owe each other, why the ship exists, what counts as justice, how grief is handled, how conflict is resolved, what kind of work is honored, what myths are told about the beginning, and whether the destination remains promise, burden, or sacred horizon. A closed world without convincing meaning does not remain stable. It merely endures until disorder learns its architecture. This is why the social design of a generational vessel may be as difficult as its ecological design. Too rigid a hierarchy, and the ship may become intolerable across centuries. Too little structure and complex infrastructure may decay beneath diffuse responsibility. Too much reverence for the founding mission, and later generations may feel crushed by the dead. Too little reverence, and the sense of continuity needed to sustain a long project may dissolve. The ship would need institutions capable of transmitting purpose without becoming theological machinery of obedience. Education would sit at the center of this. Children must learn not only literacy, history, mathematics, and art, but also the functioning logic of their world. They must understand why air matters, why food systems matter, why waste matters, why maintenance matters, why some freedoms remain linked to shared discipline. Yet, they cannot be educated only as caretakers of machinery. They must become enough more than maintenance labor that the society remains alive in spirit. That tension may define the whole civilization. Too much duty and life hardens. Too much freedom without responsibility, and the ship begins to die beautifully. Politics under such conditions would be relentless, even if quiet. Every closed system generates authority because someone must decide priorities when systems compete. Water for agriculture or reserve tanks, energy for leisure or industrial maintenance, space for private families or common infrastructure, medical expenditure on long-shot interventions or prevention elsewhere, education toward art or toward engineering, population growth now or ecological margin later. These choices cannot be escaped by rhetoric. The ship would produce them as naturally as Earth produces weather. The most frightening version of this future is easy to imagine, a vessel whose leaders justify severe command by pointing to survival, where every dissent becomes a threat to life support, and every request for transparency becomes sabotage by another name. But the more interesting danger is subtler. Even decent leaders may become harder over time because the environment itself rewards precaution. A society enclosed within vacuum can mistake caution for wisdom until it no longer knows how to leave room for human unpredictability at all. Yet the opposite danger is real too. Romantic democracy without infrastructural seriousness could kill a ship as efficiently as tyranny. Some forms of decision must be technical, and some must be binding even when unpopular. The hardest political art on a world ship would therefore be legitimacy. People must believe that necessary discipline exists for them, not over them. A ship whose laws feel alien to its own citizens may survive mechanically for a time and still rot socially. Crime, punishment, and dissent would become extraordinarily difficult topics because confinement changes their meaning. On Earth, prison exists within a larger world. Exile exists because there is somewhere else to go. Spatial separation can help societies contain danger. On a ship, space is finite and shared. To imprison someone is to continue supporting them within the ecology they threatened. To execute them is morally final in a world already too small for easy mercy. To exile them may equal death. Every punitive option becomes harsher when there is no outside. This means a lifelong ship may be forced toward new forms of justice. Restorative systems, monitored labor, psychological intervention, tiered trust structures, restricted access to systems, civic rights of restitution, or long-term supervision may all become more important than old terrestrial forms of punishment. But none of this guarantees moral success. Some crimes on such a ship would be so serious that restoration feels indecent. Sabotage to air systems, deliberate contamination, reproductive coercion, violence in critical sectors. The ship would need responses strong enough to protect the whole and humane enough to avoid becoming monstrous in the name of self-defense. A world like that would reveal, perhaps more clearly than any terrestrial state, whether a society can remain civilized when every offender remains materially entangled with the life of everyone else. The question is not academic, it is structural. If humans are to live entire lives inside a spaceship, then justice itself must be reinvented under the sign of enclosure. There is also the problem of boredom, which sounds minor only to people who have never taken duration seriously. Acute danger is easier to dramatize than repetition, but repetition may be the more corrosive enemy. A ship holding generations would need not only food, air, and law, but novelty, growth, surprise, personal projects, beauty, and room for lives that do not feel entirely pre-written by the mission. People cannot remain mentally healthy if the entire future is experienced as corridor duty, corridor duty, corridor duty for 80 years. Architecture therefore becomes a psychological technology. Variation of space, neighborhood identity, civic squares, gardens, water features if possible, changing light regimes, carefully shaped acoustics, places of privacy, places of performance, places where the ship feels less like machinery and more like a lived world. All of this would matter. A badly designed habitat might keep people alive while teaching them to hate existence. A wisely designed one might allow the mind enough room to forget the walls from time to time. Art would matter just as much. Music, theater, literature, games, sport, craft, ritual, festivals, humor, and style are not luxuries in a sealed world. They are the means by which human life resists reduction to metabolism. The more confined the environment, the more necessary unnecessary things become. A ship that understands this may remain psychologically rich. A ship that does not may turn technically successful and spiritually uninhabitable. Memory of Earth would then take on enormous importance. The first generations might remember oceans, weather, forests, open horizons, and unengineered sky. Later generations would know those things as record, myth, education, or devotional image. This creates a tension difficult to overstate. How much should a ship preserve origin memory? Too little, and the society risks becoming thin, cut off from the conditions that made human life imaginable in the first place. Too much, and younger generations may feel oppressed by nostalgia for a place they never chose and never knew. Earth might become sacred, resented, idealized, simplified, politicized, or all at once. Some may treat it as moral north, the reference world against which all ship life is judged. Others may come to see that reverence as a form of emotional colonialism by the dead. Why should people born in a vessel live under the spiritual weight of a planet that exists for them only as inherited image? That argument could define entire cultural eras aboard. There may be Earth festivals, archive days, ancestral weather halls, recorded bird calls in public gardens, rituals built around dawn simulations, maybe even schools where children are taught the old constellations as they appeared from a sky they will never see directly. These things could preserve continuity. They could also produce pain. To live well inside a ship for generations may require learning how to remember Earth honestly without allowing Earth to become a tyrannical dream that makes present life feel second-rate by definition. And then there is death. On Earth, death is embedded in worlds large enough to absorb it. There are cemeteries, rituals, landscapes, weather, ancestral places. On a ship, even mourning becomes ecological. Bodies must be buried, recycled, preserved, or otherwise managed within finite space and closed metabolism. Every possible choice carries symbolic force. Cremation may be efficient, but emotionally severe. Biological composting may feel morally beautiful to some and unbearable to others. Space burial wastes mass. Permanent tomb space competes with living space. This reveals how total the ship's claim on life would be. It governs not only how people live, but how they disappear. A civilization that spends entire lives aboard must create funeral practices capable of dignifying the dead without pretending it has the luxuries of a planet. That may produce rituals of astonishing poignancy, memorial groves grown from recovered biomass, light ceremonies tied to agricultural cycles, archive rooms where names continue speaking, ash or matter returned symbolically into life support loops with solemn language about continuity. Death in such a world could even deepen social seriousness. People may feel more visibly that the dead remain materially part of the world of the living. There is no simple way. The ship remembers physically. That fact could make life more reverent. It could also make grief harder to hide. Entire lives inside a spaceship would teach one relentless lesson: nothing leaves without consequence. At this point, the question changes tone. It is no longer only whether humans can live entire lives inside a spaceship. It becomes what kind of humans emerge if they do. A child born aboard, educated under artificial light, breathing manufactured atmosphere, eating from closed agricultural cycles, inheriting laws written for enclosure, and knowing Earth only through record, is not merely a passenger. That child is the beginning of a ship-born people. Even if biologically close to their ancestors, they would inhabit a different emotional ontology. The world would not mean to them what it meant to those who left Earth. This could become beautiful. Ship-born culture might produce deep ecological consciousness, disciplined civic ethics, powerful architecture of mutual dependence, and forms of art impossible on planets. It might also become brittle, hierarchical, fearful of disorder, suspicious of excess, and too aware that every mistake travels into the lungs of everyone else. Like all civilizations, it would contain grandeur and danger braided together. In that sense, the ship is not only a machine asking whether humans can endure, it is a crucible asking what endurance makes. A people shaped by walls, systems, scarcity, memory, and purpose may become wiser than their ancestors. They may also become harsher. Any honest answer must allow both possibilities, because a world built under pressure rarely produces one moral outcome only. The frightening truth is that technical success does not guarantee civilizational success. One can imagine a ship with stable air, stable water, good yields, manageable reproduction, competent medicine, and still a society that becomes emotionally unbearable. People may survive and still lose spontaneity, humor, trust, beauty, erotic freedom, or the sense that life contains more than managed necessity. A world can function without flourishing. That distinction matters immensely here. To live entire lives inside a spaceship, humans would need not only ecological closure but excess of another kind. Excess meaning enough room for love that is not administratively justified, enough beauty that is not strictly efficient, enough privacy that the self does not dissolve into collective systems, enough variation that children can discover who they are without feeling every identity pre-assigned by population charts and civic needs, enough truth that the mission does not rely on propaganda to maintain obedience. A sealed world that denies these things may endure for a time, but it will do so like a clenched fist. This is perhaps the deepest test in the whole idea. Can humans build a world that is closed materially without becoming closed spiritually? That is harder than air recycling, harder than food loops, harder perhaps than propulsion itself, because the answer depends on whether civilization can accept limits without worshiping them. There is another invisible layer of Earth a ship would have to replace, the microbial balance of life itself. Human beings do not live as solitary organisms. They live as ecosystems. Skin, gut, lungs, crops, water systems, surfaces, waste loops, and engineered habitats all depend on microbial populations that can nourish, protect, degrade, infect, ferment, stabilize, or kill. On Earth, this vast microscopic drama is buffered by scale. Oceans, soils, climates, animal populations, sunlight, and the open exchange of a planetary biosphere all help prevent any one microbial mistake from instantly defining the entire future of a civilization. Inside a sealed ship, that planetary buffer is gone. This means disease would be one of the most serious long-term questions of the voyage, but not only in the dramatic sense of one new plague wiping out the crew. The subtler fear may be more important. A ship can become too sterile and damage immune development. It can become too lax and allow persistent reservoirs of infection to survive in ducts, condensers, growth trays, recycled water, or communal surfaces. It can accumulate antibiotic resistance in ways that Earth's larger ecology would dilute. It can also confront strange new syndromes produced not by alien pathogens, but by its own closed biological equilibrium, slowly drifting in ways medicine did not fully predict. A successful ship would therefore need a mature microbiological culture, not merely emergency medicine. It would need surveillance systems, quarantine architecture, genomic monitoring, medical redundancy, microbial diversity management, and a public willing to accept that hygiene is not a private virtue but a constitutional duty. More importantly, it would need to avoid the fantasy that perfect control is possible. The healthiest closed world may be the one that learns how to cultivate resilient balance rather than wage permanent war against every unseen organism. That is a subtle art. A ship that misunderstands its microbiome could become sick in ways no single heroic doctor can cure because the illness would be ecological before it becomes personal. Energy would sit underneath everything like an unseen sovereign. Air needs circulation, water needs pumping and purification, food needs light, heat, nutrient cycling, transport, monitoring, and preservation. Gravity, if artificially generated through active systems rather than simple rotation, may need power. Medical devices need power. Fabrication systems need power. Data storage, communications, manufacturing, and climate control all demand the same thing, a continuous energy economy stable enough to stop being visible most of the time. On Earth, power outages are usually interruptions inside a broader world that still exists. The air remains breathable, gravity remains faithful, rivers continue moving, sunlight still arrives. On a ship, loss of power is not just inconvenience. It is the first stage of atmospheric, agricultural, medical, and political crisis. Even a temporary power shortfall could force choices so stark that later generations would remember them as constitutional trauma. Which compartments remain lit? Which crops continue receiving full illumination? Which fabrication line is shut down? Whether communication is sacrificed for thermal stability? Whether medical cooling receives priority over leisure space? These are not only engineering questions, they become moral algebra under pressure. That is why any plausible lifelong spaceship must be designed around excess energy margin, not just nominal adequacy. It must assume components will age, reactors will drift, panels will degrade, fuel cycles will underperform, storage systems will fail, and human beings will one day need more than the spreadsheet first promised. In a finite world, margin is mercy. A ship with no surplus may still survive for a time, but every bad month becomes a referendum on political legitimacy. A ship with generous reserve has a chance to remain civilized when systems degrade. Perhaps that is one of the quietest truths of any closed world. Abundance is not only comfort, it is what keeps ethics from becoming triage. Maintenance would likely become the vessel's deepest cultural religion, whether the people aboard called it that or not. The more generations a ship contains, the less any component remains merely technical. Every seal, relay, bearing, conduit, farm panel, heat exchanger, and filtration stack becomes part of the ship's biography. The first generation might still think in terms of equipment installed by engineers on Earth. The 5th or 10th generation would inherit systems already repaired, modified, cannibalized, upgraded, patched, and reinterpreted by ancestors whose names may survive only in maintenance logs and family memory. Over enough time, keeping the ship alive would cease to feel like operating a factory-designed machine. It would feel like living inside a cathedral built from accumulated repair. This changes the meaning of work profoundly. A person replacing a valve or recalibrating a growth array is not simply doing a job. They are preserving the continued existence of a world assembled through centuries of previous care. One can imagine the rise of craft lineages, maintenance guilds, sacred manuals, public holidays honoring great system recoveries, even a cultural hierarchy that places repair labor near the center of moral prestige. Such a culture could become admirable in its seriousness. It could also become rigid, suspicious of experiment, and dominated by the authority of technical castes whose knowledge is too essential to ignore. The most dangerous scenario is not necessarily dramatic breakdown. It is slow loss of deep understanding. A component fails, gets replaced with an imperfect equivalent. A fabrication process becomes more artisanal because the original industrial precision is gone. A software layer survives, but fewer people truly understand it. Over generations, the ship might continue functioning while more and more of its own complexity becomes inherited mystery. This is a terrifying but plausible future. Civilization aboard would then depend not only on engineering but on epistemic continuity. To live forever inside a ship, people must know not just how to use systems, but how to remake them when no help exists outside the hull. Exterior maintenance would give the closed world its most dramatic labor. So much of life aboard would happen under artificial weather and managed routine that people could almost forget what lies just beyond the walls. Vacuum, radiation, micrometeoroids, lethal thermal swings, perfect indifference. Then some array would fail, some shield tile would crack, some radiator line would need inspection, some communication spine would misalign, and men and women would have to step outside. That single act would reveal what the whole ship is truly for. All this interior tenderness, law, reproduction, and art exist because there is still a boundary between the human world and the universe that wants no part of it. A culture that depends on such exterior labor might begin to treat those workers with a blend of fear and reverence. They are not merely technicians. They are the people who touch non-world directly, so the rest can continue pretending they live in one. Their accidents would become ship-wide mourning. Their successes might become civic festivals. Their profession could create a special class consciousness, because anyone who has walked the outside of a world ship knows something psychologically different from those who have only lived within it. They know, with the body, rather than only the mind, how thin the wall really is. This matters because it prevents the ship from ever becoming entirely self-contained in imagination. No matter how rich the interior becomes, someone must still periodically face the truth that the ship is not a planet. It is an enclave under permanent siege by emptiness. Exterior maintenance would therefore be not only labor, but a recurring spiritual correction. It would remind the society that comfort inside is a negotiated victory, not a natural state. Sexuality and intimacy would also become more politically charged than many utopian sketches admit. On Earth, privacy is protected partly by abundance of space and social dispersal. On a ship, walls are close. Surveillance may be justified by safety. Population management shapes family formation, and partner choice can have demographic consequences. Under such conditions, even ordinary desire acquires social weight. A civilization that pretends otherwise is lying to itself. The question is not whether intimacy becomes political. It inevitably does. The question is whether politics can remain civilized while acknowledging that fact. This could produce very different cultural outcomes. Some ships may embrace radical openness, treating sexual education, contraception, reproductive planning, and relationship norms as part of public health and civic ethics. Others may become restrictive, moralizing, suspicious of unsanctioned bonds because they fear every unplanned relationship as a potential destabilizer of demographic or social equilibrium. Neither path is automatically humane. Total permissiveness without structural care can become irresponsible in a closed system. Heavy control can become spiritually mutilating. The most successful world ship would need a difficult generosity here. It must allow love, attraction, heartbreak, experimentation, and even some degree of mess, because a society that sterilizes intimacy in the name of order becomes less a world than a managed breeding project. At the same time, it must remember that birth, kinship, and emotional disturbance can ripple farther in a confined population. This means the sexual ethics of the ship may become one of its most revealing mirrors. There, more than anywhere, one sees whether the society trusts human beings enough to let them remain complicated while still taking collective survival seriously. Then there is class. Even if the founders declared the vessel egalitarian, inequality would still threaten to grow through function. Some people control systems more central than others. Some quarters are likely quieter, better ventilated, closer to gardens, farther from machinery, or more aesthetically designed. Some children are born into lineages with greater technical knowledge, more cultural prestige, or deeper proximity to command. On Earth, inequality can expand geographically until it becomes part of a nation's background shame. On a ship, it remains compressed and therefore harder to hide. This compression could be a gift if it forces justice to become visible. It could also be a curse if elites learn how to make privilege look like operational necessity. The people maintaining reactors may need special access, yes, but does that become better food, better schooling, better mating networks, better medical care, more private space? Every closed world risks converting function into rank and rank into inheritance. Once that happens, the ship may continue in apparent order while breeding a slow civic poison. Nothing breeds resentment like daily proximity to privilege that claims it is merely technical. A serious ship constitution would therefore need active anti-caste mechanisms. Rotating leadership, transparency, cross-training, public archives, broad scientific literacy, architectural fairness, and rituals of common dependence might all help. Yet no structure solves the problem completely. Human beings generate prestige almost as naturally as waste. The question is whether the prestige system remains permeable and answerable to the common world. If not, the ship becomes a floating feudalism with excellent air recycling. Religion, or something structurally similar, would almost certainly emerge whether the founders planned for it or not. A world enclosed by walls, suspended in dark, dependent on inherited systems, shaped by ancestors, and governed by rhythms none of its children chose, almost invites metaphysics. Some would cling to old Earth religions and reinterpret them under conditions of enclosure. Others would build new forms around the ship itself, the destination star, the founding departure, the moral meaning of maintenance, the dead recycled into living loops, or the notion that the vessel is a covenant rather than merely a machine. This need not be anti-scientific. Ritual and transcendence often intensify where systems become more technical, not less, because the more people understand their dependence, the more they seek language large enough to hold that dependence emotionally. A farmer aboard such a ship may know the nutrient mathematics exactly and still speak of harvest in sacred terms. An engineer may understand reactor cycles and still feel that renewal of power is more than utility. A burial may return biomass to the agricultural loop and still be conducted with reverence no chemistry textbook can exhaust. The danger would come if religion hardens around obedience to the founding mission in ways that prevent criticism or adaptation. The gift would come if it teaches humility, solidarity, gratitude, and honest awareness of contingency. In a world like this, metaphysics could either become anesthesia or maturity. It would depend on whether the ship's spiritual life helps people face reality more cleanly or merely drapes necessity in untouchable language. Another axis often overlooked is time perception. On Earth, time comes layered through seasons, weather, celestial changes, school years, labor cycles, holidays, and biological aging within a world that keeps changing around us without asking permission. A ship must manufacture almost all of those rhythms deliberately. Day and night are programmed. Seasonal variation, if any exists, is symbolic design. Agricultural cycles are partly engineered. Festivals must be chosen. The passage of time itself risks becoming too abstract if the environment does not help embody it. This matters because human beings do not merely count time, they inhabit it. A child needs more than a calendar to feel years. Adults need more than work schedules to feel life moving. Without thick temporal texture, confinement can become psychologically flattening. One week feels like another, one decade like compressed maintenance. Civilization loses some of its atmospheric depth. A successful ship would therefore need designed time, not fake time exactly, but meaningful time. Changing light regimes, seasonal festivals, evolving civic rights, long educational stages, public anniversaries, perhaps even rotating architectural beautification or cultural cycles that give the population a sense of renewal rather than perpetual sameness. The most advanced ship may not be the one with the best machinery alone, but the one that understands how to keep duration from becoming emotionally dead. The destination itself would become one of the most destabilizing ideas on board. For the first generation, it might still be vivid. For the third, it may be a civic doctrine. For the seventh, a moral burden. For the 10th, perhaps a theological fiction, or perhaps the only thing preventing the ship from collapsing inward into pure self-reference. This creates a dangerous tension. A vessel designed to travel for generations needs a destination meaningful enough to justify sacrifice. But the longer the voyage lasts, the more likely it becomes that the people actually living aboard experience the destination as something that governs them, without ever having governed their consent. Some may come to believe the ship itself is home and always was, making the destination a romantic relic of founder psychology. Others may argue that abandoning the destination would hollow out the entire social order, turning multi-generational discipline into meaningless drift. Still others may want both, the ship as real homeland and the destination as future branch, rather than final justification. These arguments would not be abstract. They would shape labor priorities, educational narratives, architectural symbolism, and political legitimacy. In that sense, the ship has to solve one of the hardest human problems: how to orient life toward a future no one alive may personally inhabit without letting that future become tyrannical over the present. Entire civilizations on Earth fail at lesser versions of this problem. A world ship would have to solve it under permanent enclosure. Aging would transform the ship in ways that are easy to overlook when the imagination is still intoxicated by youth, engineering, and launch. A closed world designed for generations cannot think only in terms of healthy adults in their productive years. It must also become a place for frailty, chronic illness, diminishing mobility, memory loss, long recovery, and the slow dignity of lives moving toward dependency. On Earth, old age happens inside cities, families, health systems, and landscapes broad enough to absorb it. In a ship, old age becomes visible in the corridors, in lift access, in oxygen demand, in care labor, in nutritional planning, and in the politics of attention. This matters because the measure of a real world is not whether it can celebrate births, but whether it can hold the declining without treating them as system drag. A ship that worships function too much may begin to resent those who can no longer contribute in the obvious technical sense. That resentment could remain subtle. Better housing quietly reserved for the still productive. Medical intervention limited by cold arithmetic. Old people praised ceremonially while being designed out of central space. A civilization under constant pressure may start speaking the language of dignity, while calculating in the language of throughput. A humane ship would need to fight this tendency deliberately. It would need a culture in which elders are not only cared for, but recognized as carriers of memory, continuity, and emotional ballast. A grandmother who remembers the third great systems failure, a retired engineer who still knows how a vanished fabrication process once worked, an old teacher who can speak of Earth with something more living than archived footage. These people matter even when their labor is no longer industrial. In a finite world, the old are not surplus. They are part of the ship's nervous system. Yet that does not remove the practical burden. Elder care requires space, time, medicine, and younger bodies willing to invest in vulnerability they themselves may one day inherit. A society that succeeds at this becomes more than efficient. It becomes morally mature. A society that fails may still cross the stars and still not deserve its own survival. Medicine more broadly would become one of the ship's decisive civilizational arts. The fantasy version of a generation ship often treats medical systems as another technical box to be checked. Clinics, diagnostics, pharmaceuticals, surgery, and a few brilliant doctors. Real life would be harsher. Medicines degrade. Supply chains do not exist beyond what the vessel itself can produce or synthesize. Rare conditions continue to occur even in carefully screened populations. Accidents happen, pregnancies go wrong, cancers emerge, bones fail, minds fracture. Children are born with conditions no simulation predicted. A world ship would need not just medical treatment, but a full medical culture able to renew itself across centuries. That means training, constant training, not only of doctors, but of nurses, technicians, emergency responders, pharmacists, mental health workers, rehabilitation specialists, reproductive care teams, and people who understand the interfaces between medicine, ecology, law, and ethics. A ship can keep a small crew alive with highly specialized experts. It cannot keep generations alive unless medical knowledge becomes part of the common inheritance rather than the property of a tiny priesthood. There is also a darker question. What happens when the ship faces illnesses it can treat badly but not cure? On Earth, patients and families often live within the emotional framework that somewhere else, some larger hospital, some more advanced lab, some other city or country might hold another option. On a ship, there is no elsewhere. When the medicine available has reached its true ceiling, that ceiling is the world. This would change the emotional texture of care. Decisions about who receives advanced intervention, how much energy or material is spent on one difficult case, when comfort replaces cure, all of this would acquire a severity. Most planetary societies are buffered from facing so nakedly. A ship that survives long enough must therefore develop not only high medicine but tragic wisdom. It must know how to fight, how to palliate, how to mourn, and how to resist letting every difficult case become a referendum on whether the closed world is morally sufficient. Without that wisdom, medicine itself could become one more site where the walls feel unforgivably close. Mental health would be its own weather system aboard such a vessel. Confinement, repetition, inherited mission pressure, surveillance, demographic scrutiny, grief that cannot disperse geographically, and the knowledge that there is no outside all push in the same direction. A ship may have beautiful gardens, art, and rituals, and still produce private despair. The danger is not that everyone becomes miserable at once. The more plausible danger is chronic psychic abrasion, a population that continues functioning while accumulating quiet sadness, diffuse resentment, claustrophobic anger, low-grade dissociation, and periods of emotional numbness that no one can fully cure because the source is structural. This is why a serious world ship would need a civic psychology deeper than most modern states possess. It would need to normalize counseling, peer care, emotional education, conflict mediation, ritual release, and spaces where grief or fury can be expressed without becoming sabotage. It would need to make room for solitude without allowing solitude to harden into disappearance. It would need systems for responding to addiction, obsession, erotic fixation, paranoia, depression, and the spiritual exhaustion of living under a mission older than one's own consent. Suicide would likely be one of the hardest truths to face. Not because ship life is necessarily hopeless, but because any serious human society contains despair somewhere, and despair inside a closed world carries special force. The death of one person is never only personal in a finite ecology. It affects families, labor, memory, and social trust. If self-harm occurs in a critical role or in a technically sensitive area, the consequences can radiate farther. A mature ship culture would have to speak of this plainly. Denial would be deadly. Yet overexposure could create its own contagions of meaning. The civilization would need careful language, careful care, and enough collective honesty to admit that a functioning world is not the same thing as a world every mind finds easy to bear. Education deserves an even larger place in the story because it is where a ship decides whether it is merely surviving or actually reproducing civilization. A classroom on a world ship would carry a burden very different from a classroom on Earth. It is not just transmitting literacy, mathematics, and socialization. It is preparing children to inherit a world whose fragility is not theoretical. Every lesson about biology, engineering, law, history, and ethics would also be a lesson about why the walls have not failed yet. But a ship that educates only for maintenance will eventually produce a spiritually narrow society. Children need science and duty. They also need wonder, useless curiosity, aesthetic play, philosophy, and the right to discover talents that do not map neatly onto civic necessity. This is one of the deep tensions of the whole scenario. In a closed world, education must keep the world running. If that becomes its only purpose, then the population begins to feel like a labor reserve grown by the ship for itself. A real civilization needs more room than that. So the curriculum would likely become one of the ship's most contested institutions. Some would argue that every child must master core life support literacy and at least one maintenance-relevant discipline before pursuing personal ambition. Others would insist that over-engineering the child destroys the very humanity the ship is trying to preserve. There may be periodic swings between pragmatic schooling and more expansive humanistic ages. A system scare might produce a generation educated almost like monastic caretakers. Decades of stability might then allow a flowering of literature, speculative philosophy, music, and abstract science. This oscillation would be healthy if the ship can survive it. It would mean the vessel has not forgotten that people are not only here to keep systems alive, they are also here to make a life worth preserving. Education is where that principle must be defended most stubbornly, because every closed world is tempted to turn children into infrastructure. Language itself would drift over generations, and that drift would reveal how fully the ship had become its own world. At launch, the language aboard would still carry Earth's metaphors easily. Sea, storm, forest, autumn, avenue, border, weather, horizon, mountain, rain. Over time, those words might remain, but their emotional weight would change. Some would become ceremonial. Some would narrow into technical analogies. New words would emerge for conditions only the ship produces. Maintenance seasons, oxygen etiquette, corridor politics, gravity deck distinctions, ritualized exterior work, food cycle phases, artificial dawn qualities, old system and new system dialects. This is not trivial. Language determines what feels natural. A child born aboard may know what a forest is and still hear the word with the same distance another child on Earth hears the word glacier age mammoth. Meanwhile, a term for a specific hum in air processing at night might carry intense emotional familiarity because that sound belongs to home in a way no tree ever has. Ship language would therefore become a profound anthropological marker. It would show more clearly than official doctrine ever could how far the people aboard had moved from planetary assumptions. At some point, arguments would erupt over preservation. Should schools maintain Earth-standard language with conscious discipline? Should archival language be taught like a sacred or classical tongue? Should drift be allowed to proceed naturally because authenticity matters more than ancestry? Those fights would not be merely literary. They would be about whether continuity with origin is moral obligation or aesthetic burden. To live entire lives inside a ship is also to decide what kind of language deserves to name the world. Aesthetics would become surprisingly political under these conditions. On Earth, beauty often appears to float above infrastructure, even when that is partly illusion. On a ship, beauty must compete directly with mass budgets, maintenance schedules, lighting efficiency, psychological utility, and spatial economy. Every mural, every fountain, every ornamental tree, every non-essential ceiling height, every public square, every place built for music rather than storage becomes an explicit statement that civilization is more than survival. That is why ship architecture could divide into eras. One phase may favor strict utilitarian lines after a system scare or demographic squeeze. Another phase, born during relative stability, may reopen interior spaces, commission artists, restore old ceremonial halls, or build new garden sectors because the population has learned that bleak efficiency breeds long resentment. These aesthetic struggles would matter because people living under permanent confinement read walls more intensely than people on planets do. A society that houses itself like machinery trains its citizens to feel machinic. A society that invests in beauty is making a claim about what kind of beings it believes them to be. There is even room for regional identity inside one vessel. One section known for warm light and civic murals, another for gardens and old Earth archive halls, another for industrial severity and proud maintenance culture. Neighborhood identity, if allowed to flourish without hardening into caste, might help prevent the ship from collapsing into emotional monotony. The vessel would then contain not just rooms, but districts, moods, accents, and symbolic geographies. Such internal variety could become one of the most powerful ways a closed world keeps from feeling psychologically flat. Economy inside the ship would have to be carefully imagined as well. If every critical system is collectively necessary, what does wealth mean? On Earth, markets operate inside abundance, waste, and externalization. A ship has less room for those indulgences. Yet a society without any personal ownership, exchange, or differential reward may also become stagnant or coercively uniform. The challenge would be to invent an economy compatible with finite loops, shared survival, and human appetite for initiative. One possibility is a layered economy. Core life support goods and services remain guaranteed by citizenship because no one can be allowed to fall outside air, water, food, medicine, and shelter without threatening the moral legitimacy of the whole ship. Beyond that floor, citizens might trade in crafted goods, cultural production, prestige services, private space enhancements, educational opportunities, or temporary access to scarce luxuries such as rare fresh produce, custom fabrication, quiet rooms, or time in specially designed recreational zones. Such a system might preserve motivation without allowing market logic to colonize the foundations of life. But even here, danger lurks. Scarcity mixed with human desire can breed black markets quickly. If certain medicines, private spaces, reproductive permissions, data archives, or sensory luxuries become too tightly controlled, informal exchange networks would almost certainly arise. A ship would then face one of the oldest civilizational truths in its most compressed form. People find ways around systems that deny their felt needs. Whether those parallel economies become corrosive or creative would depend on how just the official economy already is. Closed worlds do not abolish politics. They intensify its consequences. Artificial intelligence and automation would likely become indispensable, but their success would introduce new dilemmas. A ship that spans generations cannot rely only on continuous human manual labor for every diagnostic, fabrication, ecological calibration, medical scan, educational adaptation, and navigation correction. Automation would be necessary. Machine partners, predictive systems, maintenance models, adaptive learning environments, and perhaps even highly sophisticated civic coordination tools would shape life everywhere aboard. At first, this seems like pure relief. Let the machines handle what humans would otherwise exhaust themselves doing. But a successful automated world raises a dangerous possibility: dependence without understanding. If enough of the ship's deepest functions are preserved by systems no living citizen fully grasps, then authority migrates silently. The ship may still appear self-governing while in practice relying on inherited machine cognition that no generation dares fully rewrite. That is a very strange political condition. The Constitution is partly written in code and partly remembered in ritual. Some societies might embrace this, treating machine systems as guardians of continuity. Others would grow suspicious and insist on radical transparency and human legibility, even at the cost of efficiency. Both positions carry risk. Too much automation, and the population becomes like tenants in a world whose real landlord is technical opacity. Too little, and human labor may become so burdened that creativity, freedom, and even competence begin to erode under constant demand. A successful ship would therefore need not only good machines, but a philosophy of delegation. It must know what can be entrusted to systems and what must remain visibly answerable to living citizens. Migration inside the ship could become an entire cultural drama. On Earth, migration usually implies crossing landscapes into other climates, economies, or sovereignties. In a world ship, physical distance may be small, yet social distance could still be great. Moving from one sector to another might mean different gravity preferences, different food cultures, different prestige hierarchies, different educational traditions, even different moral attitudes toward Earth memory or the destination. Internal migration would therefore let the ship remain socially dynamic without requiring external space. This could be healthy. It would allow reinvention, escape from family expectations, mixing of traditions, and the correction of local stagnation. But it could also provoke conflict. Some districts may resent outsiders. Technical sectors may become hereditary and guarded. Communities built around strict reproductive planning, aesthetic philosophy, or spiritual interpretation of the mission may resist dilution. A ship large enough for generations might therefore need a robust politics of internal movement just to prevent its own neighborhoods from ossifying into sealed tribes. This point is easy to miss because the whole vessel is already enclosed. Yet precisely because the outside is inaccessible, the inside must remain mobile enough that people can still experience some form of frontier without needing a new world. A ship that contains no internal frontier of personal reinvention may become psychologically suffocating, even if every technical system performs beautifully. Emergency doctrine would become another hidden axis of civilization. Every world has emergencies: fires, epidemics, depressurizations, contamination events, structural failure, crop blight, power loss, violence. On Earth, emergencies unfold against a vast background of unaffected systems. On a ship, major emergencies threaten the architecture of total life. That means drills, redundancies, command chains, and public discipline may become more culturally central than most modern populations would comfortably tolerate. Children might grow up practicing seal-off procedures the way others practice fire drills. Adults may carry muscle memory for corridor isolation, atmospheric masks, emergency rationing, or sector quarantine. Songs, proverbs, and jokes might form around ancient crisis events. Some citizens would likely resent how much civic life bends around contingencies that may never happen in their lifetime. Others would consider such resentment childish because they understand that preparedness is one of the prices of having no rescuing horizon outside the hull. This could deepen the whole emotional climate of the ship. A people who can never fully forget emergency remain serious in a way planets often permit people not to be. That seriousness could produce resilience, stoicism, mutual dependence, and gratitude. It could also produce chronic vigilance, punitive culture, and leaders who know that fear of catastrophe can always be used to discipline dissent. Emergency doctrine is therefore never only about safety. It is one of the main places where a closed civilization decides whether it wants readiness to serve freedom or freedom to be permanently narrowed by readiness. There is also the question of arrival, which grows stranger the longer one lives inside the vessel. If several generations are born and die aboard, then the destination ceases to be merely an endpoint. It becomes something like a theological claim. Some may still believe passionately in landfall, planetary settlement, orbital construction, or whatever form the mission's completion was meant to take. Others may suspect that arrival itself is a dangerous fantasy because a world ship that survives long enough has already become what it was supposed to protect. It has become a world. This creates a final, severe irony. The better the ship works, the more the need for the destination may become ambiguous. If the vessel has achieved true worldhood, then disassembling its culture into a new planetary setting could feel like migration, liberation, or betrayal depending on who is asked. Some citizens might dream of soil, open sky, and real weather as the completion of everything. Others might see planets as violent places full of uncontrollable variables compared with the hard-earned intimacy of a ship whose dangers, however severe, are at least known. A civilization born under enclosure may not unanimously crave expansion onto a surface. It may fear the very openness its founders worshipped. That means the ultimate test of a successful world ship may not be whether it reaches somewhere, but whether its people still desire to arrive in the way the mission once imagined. If they do, then the ship was a bridge. If they do not, then the ship has become a destination in its own right. Either outcome would rewrite the original purpose of the voyage. So could humans live their entire lives inside a spaceship? In the narrow biological sense, perhaps yes. With enough size, enough redundancy, artificial gravity, robust ecological engineering, careful reproduction, cultural intelligence, and political legitimacy, a ship could hold generations. Children could be born there. Adults could work, love, argue, govern, create, and die there. A civilization could, in principle, pass through the stars without any one individual ever needing a planet beneath their feet. But the true answer is harder and far more interesting. Humans could live entire lives inside a spaceship only if the spaceship stopped being understood as a ship. It would have to become a world in the full sense: ecological, political, emotional, educational, artistic, reproductive, and moral. It would have to replace not just transport, but weather, landscape, inheritance, memory, and the invisible kindnesses of Earth that modern people almost never notice until they imagine losing them. That is why the concept is so compelling. It reveals how much a world really is. A spaceship for a few years is engineering. A spaceship for entire lives is civilization under pressure. It asks whether human beings can carry enough atmosphere, enough meaning, and enough mercy with them to remain human when the old planet is no longer around to do the work silently. The answer may be yes, but if it is, the vessel that achieves it will not merely be one more machine in space. It will be one of the strangest and most ambitious worlds the species has ever made.